How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Samach Gimel, Daf 63 of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Friends, your friends. Today we will be discussing shemitah produce, kind of. Meaning, yesterday we had started the fifth and final parak of Masechta Avodah Zarah, and we had talked about receiving wages for work with Yein Nesech, right? If you work with Yein Nesech and you get paid for doing work with Yein Nesech, are those wages permitted or forbidden? We said that they are problematic. Along the way, we had discussed shemitah, we had discussed Perish Shvius, and we had said that being a poil, being a worker, the money would be okay. But Demei Shvius, though, we had talked about that money received either for payment for it, right? If a person sells Perish Shvius, so that money, or if something is swapped for Perish Shvius, so then that which is received in exchange for them has Kedushas Shvius itself. Those Demei Shvius is essentially going to be the focus, the basis for today's daf, particularly when that payment is made later, at a later point, once the actual fruits that they were exchanged for were already consumed, right? So if one person receives Perish Shvius and then pays back at a later point, the question is that going to be considered Demei Shvius, which then gets us into later deferred payments in general, and how are they or aren't they connected to the initial event that they are being paid for? So, for example, so this kind of leads us to our different sections. There are three sections of today's daf. The first one being paying for shemitah produce at a later time. We will then discuss paying for a harlot at a later time. Of course, there's the halachas regarding esnon zona, payment for a harlot. That cannot be used for a korban in the Beis HaMikdash. So what if the payment happened at a later point? And finally, paying for employees' purchases at a later time. This has to do with an employer allowing his employees to go and buy stuff, and then he's going to foot the bill. And what are his responsibilities in terms of what they buy? So, however, this is what's on the agenda today for Daf Samach Gimel Masechta Avodah Zarah. Without further ado, let us jump in. We are going to begin on Daf Samach Beis Omid Beis, about 10 or 15 lines or so from the bottom of Samach Beis Omid Beis. We're going to discuss an incident with the Bey Reb Yanai, the household of Reb Yanai, and that is really going to be the basis for today's daf. Here we go. When Daf Samach Beis Omid Beis, about 10-15 lines from the bottom. Devei Reb Yanai, Yazve Peri Shvius Me'onim Ufaru Lehu Bashminis. You hear this? As I was saying in the introduction, the deferred payment. So what happened was, so it was shemitah, okay? It was shemitah. All right. Now we discussed, I think it came up yesterday, right? We discussed the Zman Abir, the concept of on shemitah. Let's say if we took the example of pomegranates, so long as there are pomegranates available for the public outside, so you can have your own stash of pomegranates at home and you can eat them and enjoy them as Perish Shvius. However, once there ceases to be pomegranates available for everybody, well, then we get to the Zman Abir. As we discussed yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, that there's a machlekes between what exactly now happens at the Zman Abir. Let's just say you have to get rid of them one way or another, either make them hefker or actually like destroy them, whatever it is, you have to get rid of them at the Zman Abir. So now, here were these poor people, and it was shemitah, and they had Perish Shvius. Now, the Zman Abir was coming, and they were going to have to get rid of these fruits. So what the household of Yanai did was they said to these poor people, why don't you give us fruit that you're going to have to be getting rid of anyways, and then post Shemitah, after Shemitah, we're going to pay you back for the fruits. And now the question is that this payment, which is happening on the 8th year, is that going to be considered Demei Shvius or not? Meaning, if they are considered demei shvius, that they have the same, essentially, status of the fruits that they received from the poor people, well then, whatever fruits they give to the poor people would be essentially post-Zman Bi'ur shemitah produce, because it would have the same kedusha and it would be post-Bi'ur, so even if they're paying them a year later in the 8th year, it doesn't matter. They would still be awesome. So Tosfos talks a little bit about some specifics, but bigadol, let's just go with that. That basically, if the fruits that are being paid back to the aniyim on the next year are considered Dumei Shvius, well then, even though it's a year later, they would still be awesome. So now again, so says the Gemara, the Rabbi Yanai, by the household of Rabbi Yanai, Yazfei Peri Shvius Me'aniyim, they borrowed shemitah fruit, Peri Shvius, from poor people during shemitah. Okay, that's fine. Ufaru b'shmitas, and then the following year, post shemitah, they paid back the poor people, and that was considered fine. They did it. Asu amrulei l'Rabbi Yechanan, but the people came to Rabbi Yechanan, and they said, Amlu, and they said to Rabbi Yechanan, look what happened. Rabbi Yanai, they borrowed Peri Shvius, now they're paying it back. Amlu, Rabbi Yechanan says, take a chill pill. Yo, Sein Abdin, all good. The Rabbi Yanai is all good. And now this kind of shifts into kind of the next sort of layered section. I don't know if the right word is layered, but not embedded either, but the next, I can't remember what the word I'm thinking, nested section in, again, as I said, the focus of today's daf is going to be understanding this scenario with Rabbi Yanai, of paying at a later point for these fruits. But along the way, we're going to use adjacent sugyas in order to understand it. So now we're moving into the first adjacent sugya, which is Esnon Zona. And says Rabbi Yochanan, all good what they were doing by the household of Yanai. Uchnegdom be'esnon mutter. And similarly, when it comes to Esnon Zona, it would be mutter. Who could tell me what Esnon Zona is? Well, a harlot's wage. So for example, if a fellow goes to a harlot and they do what harlots and clients do, and he pays her with a sheep, well, that sheep was payment for harlotry. And that sheep cannot be offered as a korban in the Beis HaMikdash. It's Esnon Zona. L'savi Esnon Zona Mechikelev Beis Hashem Elokecha L'choneda L'chonedava, something like that. So that's Esnon Zona. It cannot be offered as a korban. But what if the sheep was not paid immediately, was not given immediately? What if it was given later on, at a later point? So it says of Yochanan, the same would apply to Esnon Zona, that if the sheep is given at a later point, it would not be considered Esnon Zona, just like over here, the fruits that the Rabbi Yanai is paying back the Aniyim with is not considered Peris Shvius, is not considered Demei Shvius. Yos in Adin Uchnegdom Besnan Mutter Desanya, as within the Bible, Nosan Law Veloy Ba'aleh. If the client gives the harlot a sheep, but they didn't end up having bia, or if they had bia, but the payment never came, she was never given her sheep, mutter, so it's permitted. There would not be Esnon Zona in either of those cases. Nasan lo v'leba aleh pshita. Well, if he gave her the sheep, but they never had bia, so obviously that should be okay. They never had bia, right? If they never had bia, well, then it's not harlotry. And if it's not harlotry, so the sheep is simply a gift. And she can offer that as a gift. Sure, a gift she could offer as a korban. Why not? It's very nice of her. Visu, and more so in the Seifa, in the Sefer where we say, and if they had bia, but then he never gave her the sheep. Well, if he never gave her the sheep, then what are we even talking about? Harlot yoiv lo v'lo midi. He never gave her anything. And since he never gave her anything, then what are we talking about? Her esnan is mutter. There was no esnan. He never gave her anything. So what's going on? Right? If he gave her something, but they never had bia, obviously it's permitted. If they had bia, but he never gave her anything, well then there's nothing to be offered. So what's going on over here? Rather, this is how to understand the Braise. That if he gave her the sheep and at a later point they had bia, or if they had bia but the payment only came later, mutter in both of those cases, it's mutter. So we see that when the payment is at a later point, it's disconnected. When it comes to esnan zona, it's disconnected from the bia. And therefore, it's not considered esnan zona. Just like we said by Devei Rabbi Yanai, that in the 8th year, when they give the fruits, it's disconnected from the fruits from the 7th year that they consumed a long time earlier. And that payment in the 8th year would be disconnected and would not be Demei Shvius. Snafrek de Gemore. Where am I? So, okay, fine. Says the Gemara in the bottom line of the Daf Beis Amud Beis. Nosan lo be'achar kach ba'aleo. 1 second, why are we saying that if he gives her the sheep, the esnan zona, and then later on they have bia? Why is that not esnan zona? We said if he gives her the sheep and then at a later point they have bia, it's not esnan zona. Why? When they eventually have bia, lecho ola isur esnan lemafreya. Well, then retroactively, the sheep would be considered esnan zona. I don't understand. Omer Abelazar says, Abelazar kishekadma ve'krivatu. Well, she had already offered the M. So if he gives her a sheep, and then they didn't end up having bia, she goes and offers the sheep as a, korban shlomim, let's say. Very nice. And then at a later point they have bia. Well, I mean, the animal has already been offered. It's gone. So, what's the scenario? Well, if what he said to her, well, he gives her the sheep, and he says, it's yours now. It's yours. And then she goes, and they don't have bia, she goes and she offers it as a korban, and at some later point they had bia. Well, of course it was a mutter. Of course it was permitted. He gave it to her at that point. They didn't have bia. It was not esnan zona. She offered it as a korban. Of course it was permitted. You could skip the next few words. Oh no, don't skip the next few words. Skip the next few words after the next few words. Right, so pshita deshari dehad leise b'shas bia. Well, she offered it as a korban. At the time of bia, it was already gone. He gave it to her. He said, it's yours now. She went and offered it as a korban. At a later point, they had bia. By that point, the animal was already gone. So what? So of course, it's okay. Right. You could get rid of those words if you want to. He gave it to her as a gift. Now, if he didn't say to her, acquire it now, then how can she offer it? Right? If he gave her the sheep, and the sheep is not hers now, it'll be payment for bia. So if it's not hers at that point, how could she have then taken it to the Beis Hamikdash and offer it? You can't do that. The ish ki yakdish is beiso kodesh omer achmona. The Torah says that a person who makes hektish his house, ma beiso b'rshut, so just like your house is something that you own, avkol b'rshut, so also anything that you own. You can only offer as korbanos things that are yours. If he didn't say to her, this is your sheep right now, so it isn't her sheep. And therefore, how could she have offered it? So what's going on? If he says it's yours now, well, then of course she can offer it. They didn't have bia, it's hers, she can offer. If he's not saying that it's hers, well, then how can she offer it? It's not hers. Elo, the Omar law, what he says to her is, the havigabich ad shas bia. It should be here until bia. So he's saying, look, I'm leaving this sheep here. At some point, we're going to have bia and it's going to be awesome, and then this sheep is going to be yours. If you need it before then, you could take it. It's fine. So that's the scenario where we're saying that the korban would be mutter. That since he said to her, if you need it right now, it could be yours. So therefore, if Shitaka takes it and offers it as a korban, we're saying it is permitted since they didn't have bia at that point. But Rabbi Shaya asks a kasha. Kodma vigdishatu mau. What if she was makdishit? Okay. So meaning we had talked about what happens in a scenario where she offered it. Okay, we had talked about if the client gives her this sheep for Estin Zona, they don't have bia, she offers it as a korban, we said it's okay. What if she didn't offer it as a korban? What if she set it aside to be a korban, but didn't actually offer it? She was makdishit. Cheva, what do you say? What do you say? But Rabbi Shai asks, Kodma vigdishatu, if she was makdishit, but didn't yet offer it, and then they had bia mao. What's the halacha? That since we say that anything said to the Rabban Shalom, it's as if it's given. So if you're it's up in the Rambam talks about it in the context of, let's say you're selling something to the treasury and you state a price that's lower than it's actually worth. The second you say it, it's as if it's given to the treasury. The point is that when it comes to hektish, your words are important, and it's like they happened. And therefore, once she says, I'm going to bring this animal as a korban, it's as if she brought it as a korban. And it's mutter. Because by the time that they had bia later on, it was already makdished, and it's considered like it was already offered, as if it was actually offered. So therefore, therefore we should view it as though it's already been offered and it's permitted. Or do we say, yes, but the fact of the matter is it wasn't offered. And at the time of bia, this animal was alive. Should it be considered esnan zona? It exists right now. We should answer it from Rab Elazar, because what did Rab Elazar say just a few minutes ago? Rab Elazar, I know it says Rab Eliezer here, but there's a different case that changes to Rab Elazar for the Amud, so I'm going with that. So V'tivshav midar Rab Elazar, Dam Rab Elazar shekadma v'krivatu. That Rab Elazar said, well, when she offers it, well then it won't be. If at the time of bia it was already offered, well then it will not be considered esnan zona. Davga krivatu, yeah, specifically if it was mamish offered already. Avadishatu, but just simply being makdishit, low. Then it would be considered esnan zona. It would not be okay. No, so Rabbi Shai asks Akasha, what happens if she was only makdishit, but didn't actually offer it yet? So we wanted to say, well, if we're Madaik and what Rabbi Elazar says, so Rabbi Elazar says that specifically if she offered it, then it's not esnan zona, it's okay. Here she didn't offer it, so therefore it's a problem. So says the Gemara, well actually, Rabbi Elazar gufe ka mibai alei. No, Rabbi Shai was asking, how do we understand Rabbi Elazar? We're assuming that to understand what Rabbi Elazar is saying is that if it's not offered, so then it won't be esnan zona, but if it's not offered, then it would still be esnan zona. How do you know? What did Rabbi Elazar mamish hold there? So Rabbi Elazar gufe come by my mifsha pshitale li Rabbi Elazar dekrivatu davka aval dishatu lo daisa b'shas bia. Is it a davar pashit like we were saying a minute ago? That Rabbi Elazar says dafka if it was offered, so then it would be permitted. But so long as it wasn't offered, since it's still alive, it would be forbidden even though you were makdishit. Is that what he's saying? Like we wanted to say, oh Dilma, or perhaps hikrivatu pshitale maybe, sure, it was obvious to Rabbi Elazar that if she mamish offered it, so of course it would be permitted. It was already offered at the time of Bia. It didn't exist when they were having Bia. But maybe Rabbi Elazar himself wasn't sure about if she was simply makdish it. So Kilu Rabbi Elazar stated the part that he knew for sure. He knew for sure that if she had already offered it as a korban, then it would be permitted. He didn't comment on what would happen if she was simply makdish it but hadn't get offered it, because he didn't know what the halacha would be taken. We say, let's go weiter. So we had said, mutter. So that was really the scenario that is shaykh to us with Rabbi Yana in the later pay, the deferred payment. So right, we had said that if they have bia and then he pays her at a later point, so then it is not their bia, and then he pays her at a later point. So that payment is not going to be considered esnun zoner. But we have a contradiction. Apilu mikanad sholish shonim esnono oser. Have you heard the kasha? Who wants to explain the kasha? No, Reb Neil. Reb Neil, explain us the kasha? I know it's not it's not zenena v'zelo chaser, but no, what's going on here, Reb Neil? So we have a brayso that says that when it comes to Essen Zoner, even if he pays her 3 years later, it's still considered Esnan Zona. So what are we talking about? There be, and then he pays her later, it's not Esnan Zona, Mapitom. Again, for a minute we have a contradiction. That if he has beer with her, and then later gives the payment, we have a brayso that says even if he pays her 3 years later, it'll be considered Esnan Zona. Rav Chizda lo kasha, no problem. Ha de Omar is baili bitole zeh. Ha de Omar lo is baili bitole stam. It depends what he said to her. Depends on how he said it. If he says, "Have beer with me, and I'll give you this sheep," well, since he specified this particular sheep, well, then it's considered like she has ownership of it from this point. Even if he gives it to her 3 years later, it's still going to be considered Esnan Zona. But if he says with a sheep, well, then 3 years later, it would not be considered Esnan Zona. Right? At a later point, it would not be considered Esnan Zona. To which the Gemara says, who cares? Even if he says, even if he says, be with me for this sheep, why would that be considered hers? She didn't make a kinyan on it. She didn't make a kinyan meshicha on it. So how could it be considered hers? He says, I'm going to give you this sheep. She wasn't kona it. Oh, okay. One way to say is, well, she was a non-Jewish harlot. And therefore, right, and I guess a kinyan meshicha seems to be a Jewish thing. Rashi points out that, kano miyad amisecho, says the pasuk. From the hand, I guess a kinyan meshicha is davka by Yidden. So therefore, when he said that he was going to give it to her, it's already hers from that point. Okay, fine. So when he says bital lezeh, it's already hers. And I guess if she's non-Jewish, she can offer it as non-Jews could offer korbanos, right? But not if it's Esnan Zona. Okay. Alternatively, Lolam B'zon Yisrael is a Jewish harlot. But it's talking about a scenario. So the reason why, even 3 years later, it would be considered Esnan Zona is because the sheep was in her chotzer at the time that they had bia. 1 second now. If we're telling me that it's a Jewish harlot, and when we say that if they had bia, and then he gives her the sheep 3 years later, so it's still going to be considered Esnan Zona. How so? Well, because the sheep was already in her chotzer at the time they had bia, so what are you telling me 3 years later? But if it was in her chotzer at the time that they had bia, she was going it now. What are you talking about 3 years later? So lo tzricha de shavya nila aputiki de omar lo imaisino lechzuze mikana ad yom ploni muto ve'ilo shakle be'esnonich. Well, it's an interesting scenario. Yes, the sheep was in her chotzer at the time that they had bia, but what he had said to her was, look, I'm going to pay you cash. I'm going to pay you cash. You tell me how much it costs in cash. I'll pay you. And I'll pay you within the next 3 years. If we want to use the example from the Bryce, right? Even if he pays her 3 years later. I mean, that's a little far-fetched. Maybe let's say, give me a few weeks. Give me a few weeks. I'll pay you back by the end of the month or whatever it is. I'll pay you by the end of the month. And if I don't pay you, here is this sheep. This sheep will be yours if I don't pay you. So, in terms of the question, it was like well, it was already hers at the time of bia. Yeah, but that wasn't actually meant to be the payment. This was an aputiki. Aputiki, I believe, stands for like po tehe tiki. I don't remember what that stands for. But like, you're going to collect from this. But the idea was, really, I'm going to pay you money and you're not going to collect from this sheep. I'll pay you by the end of the month. Now, if comes the end of the month and he didn't pay her, well, then she gets that sheep. So we're saying even a month later or 3 years later, this sheep would still be considered esnan zona, since it was specified that this will be the sheep that she'll collect from if he doesn't end up paying her. And that is the scenario where we're saying, right, so in that scenario, it would be esnan zona, but if we're not talking about where he specifically makes this sheep connected to her payment, well, then it would not be considered esnan zona for the deferred payment of the sheep. And now we get to the third section of today's daf, which is paying for employees' purchases at a later time. Let's just jump in to kind of understand what this is related to, what he's talking about. And this, of course, relates back to the scenario with Reb Yanai and the payment of he borrowed, his family borrowed Paris Shvius and then paid back in the 8th year the deferred payments. We talked about the deferred payments in the context of esnan zona, and now we're going to talk about another scenario of deferred payments. Most of Sheshes asakasha oimuradam lechamarov vilafoyalo. If you have an employer and he says to his donkey drivers, I guess who he was employing, or his workers who he's employing, he says to them, lichu v'ichlu bedinar zeh tzu'u v'shesu bedinar zeh ve'eno choshesh lo mishum shvius lo mishum meiser v'lo mishum yein nesech. So if the employer gives to his employees a dinar, and he says to them, here, this dinar is yours, do with it what you want. Well, in that case, he's completely disconnected. He says, take the dinar, right? He's not responsible. He pays his employees. They can do whatever they want with their money. He doesn't have to be concerned about shemitah. If they end up buying perish shvius, Rashi's takamachlik is actually toisvis about what the concern is with the shemitah. Let's just go with Rashi, that basically maybe he'll buy perish shvius from an am haaretz, and then you're not allowed to buy perish shvius from an am haaretz, and then that money becomes demei shvius. You don't have to be concerned about that. Or what was the next thing? Meiser, I think it's referring to tevel. If he's basically going to be paying them with tevel, if they buy tevel, or yenetzech, if they buy yenetzech. It doesn't. When he gives them the dinar and says, "Here, take this, do it," buy yourself something. That's not his responsibility what they buy. Okay, again. Go and get yourself something to eat with this dinar that I'm giving you. I'm giving you this dinar, go and buy something to drink. It's not his problem, it's not the employer's problem. He doesn't have to be concerned. Lo mishum shvius, not because they're going to end up buying shvius. Lo mishum meiser, or not because maybe they're going to buy untied food. V'lo mishum yenesech, or that they'll purchase yenesech. That's not his problem. He says, take the money, it's yours, not mine, do with it what you want. But if he says to them, Tzu ve'ichlu vani poireya, but if he says to them, go and get you something to eat, and I'll pay for what you are eating. Tzu shesu vani poireya, go and get something to drink, and I will pay for it. Well, all of a sudden now, choshesh mishum shvius mishum meiser mishum yen nesech. All of a sudden now, we're saying in this brisa, he does have to be concerned about maybe he'll be paying for shvius, tevel, yen nesech. Even though at the time that he's paying, it's already in their bellies. They already ate it. It's already consumed. We're still saying it's a concern. Da-da. Do-do-do. Da-da-da. Bum. Ba-da-dum. Ba-dum. Nu cheva. Why is this relevant? Why is this interesting? Because we're saying that when Rabbi Yanai paid back for the Peirush Shvius in the 8th year, we're saying, it's disconnected. They already ate the Peirush Shvius ages ago. It's a separate thing. Well, over here, they already ate whether it's shemitah, tevel, yenesech. We're saying it is his problem. It is connected to what was purchased, even though they already consumed it. So we see that when the employer is going to be paying later on, once they already consumed it, you still have to be concerned about Dmei Isser. Hachanami here also by the Dver B'yanai. Ki kapara, when he is going to pay back the aniyim, Dmei Isser kapara, it should be considered Dmei Shvius. Now, interesting, what wasn't clear, this is nothing major, technical thing. When it comes to the scenario with Dver B'yanai, there's a lot of tosfos on this. Not so much to take away from. Interesting. There's been a lot of tosfos, but not so many tosfos takeaways. But through learning tosfos, I think a mahalach was developed where there's actually an interesting parallel. Not an interesting parallel. The parallel between the two scenarios is that there's actually a layer to the Dver B'yanai that was not clear so far in the Gemara, which is that there's just like over here, you have the employer, you have the employees, and you have the store owner who's being paid, right? So the store owner is providing the food, whether it's the potential shvius, tevel, yei nesech. The chedvani, the store owner, is providing the food to the employees, and then you have the employer who's going to be paying the store owner. So we have a similar setup. Also, the Dver B'yanai, you have the poor people, who are like the store owners, right? They are providing the Peirush Shvius to Rabbi Yanai's family. They are like the employees. They are receiving the in the case of shemitah, the Peirush Shemitah, and then Rabbi Yanai is going to be the one paying back the aniyin afterwards. So there's that kind of extra layer which I saved until now because this is where we really see kind of the three three. I don't even know what the categories, I guess. You have, in this case, you have the store owner, the employees, and the employer. And by Rabbi Yanai, you have the poor people, the household of Rabbi Yanai, and Rabbi Yanai who's going to be paying. Okay, now, so we'll say that just like the employer, when he pays the shop owner, even though the food has already been consumed, it's a problem. So we should say also that when Rabbi Yanai pays back the aniyim, even though it's at a later point, it should be also. It should be Dmei Shvius. Chevra, what do you say? Tirgamar of Chizde. So if Chizde answers Bechenvania Makifa Dmishtabid le Dechevim the Orchela Kufe Konile Dinner Gabe. So says the Gemara, well, with the case with the employer and the employees and the shopkeeper, the employer in this case and the shopkeeper have prior history. This is not a random shop. This is a shop that the employer tells the employees to go to because he has a relationship with the store owner. He buys lots of stuff. He does a lot of business with this store owner. And they have a prior relationship, and the store owner is somech on the employer. He trusts the employer. He knows that the employer is good for his commitment. And in the eyes of the store owner, immediately when the employees take whatever they take, the store owner is somech, he trusts the employer that the employer is going to be paying him, and that it's as though there's already money set aside for him immediately upon the time, right, for the storekeeper immediately at the time that the employees took what they took, and therefore, if the employees are going to be taking Perish Shvius, it's as if the Perish Shvius are being paid at the time that they're taken, at the time that they're received, since the store owner is somech on the employer that he knows that he's going to be paid. It's as if he already has the money from the time that the employees already took whatever they took. So it was actually considered immediate and it wasn't considered delayed. However, by the household of Yanai, that's not the case. Rabbi Yanai doesn't have a prior relationship with these aniyim that they are somech from the time that they gave the produce, that it's like already they got paid back during shemitah. No, it's a separate thing. There's no prior relationship there. And therefore, when Rabbi Yanai pays back the aniyim on the 8th year, it's a separate thing, disconnected. Whatever fruits they received during shemitah have long ago been consumed. And therefore, that produce of the 8th year is not Dmei Shvius. So again, Tigmar of Chisda says, B'chenvani amakifo. This is a chenvani who provides credit to the store owner provides credit to the employer. They have a prior established relationship to mishtaybed lei, that the employer is mishubad to the store owner immediately from the time that his employees take whatever they take. Because since the store owner and the employer have a prior relationship and they work together with credit and they trust each other, Kani le dinar gabe, it's as though the dinar is already by the store owner from the time that the employees take whatever they take. And if it's going to be Perish Shvius, then it would be that he's basically paying for the Perish Shvius because it's happening immediately. Avo, fact the Gemara, Chenvani she'ein makifo mai mutter. So are you telling me then that, okay, in a scenario where there's no prior relationship and there's no established credit, so we're saying in that case, it would be considered a later payment and it would be permitted. It would not be like he's paying for Shvius. But if that's the case, well then, if we look at our brisa, at this brisa that we had, this brisa was divided into two scenarios. In the first scenario, the employer gave money to the employees and said, here, take the money, do with it what you want. We said in that case, he's disconnected from the money, he's disconnected from the purchases, they can do whatever they want with the money. It's theirs. We then said, however, if he says, take what you want and I'll pay, we then say it's a problem. And now we're saying, actually, it depends. It's a problem if they have a prior relationship, the employer and the shop owner. But if they don't have a prior relationship, well, then it would be permitted. It would not be like he's paying for, let's say, Perish Shvius, because there isn't this trust. It's not as though he's immediately paying for it. It's not as though the employer has money with the shopkeeper. Well, if that's the case, again, we had two scenarios in our brisa. One was when he gives them the money and says, here, it's yours, take it, do what you want with it. The other scenario was when he has a prior relationship with the store owner, in which case it's also, but for the scenario where it's permitted, why would the brisa be giving the more obvious case, where if he gives them money and says, do with it what you want, obviously then he's not responsible. Say the more interesting case, which is even when he pays for it, he doesn't give them the money and say, do what you want with it. He's paying for it. But still, since there's no prior relationship with the store owner, it's permitted because it would be considered disconnected from their purchase that they already bought and already consumed. That would be more interesting than to say, if he gives them the money and says, here, it's your money, do what you want with it. Okay, of course that's going to be permitted to think about whatever they want. Tell me a more interesting case that even when he's paying for it, it could still be permitted if he's paying for it later and there's no prior relationship with the store owner. So again, Aval Chenvani asks the Gemara, so you're telling me Chenvani she'ein makifo, a store owner with whom there's no prior relationship and there's no credit. My mutter, we're going to say that it would be permitted. It would not be considered like he's paying for shvius or providing tevel or yenesech. If that's the case, adatoni, when the Brisa says that the case that's mutter is tzu ve'ichlu b'dinar zeh, here, take this dinar, go have a good time, eat what you want. Tzu shesu b'dinar zeh, here, take this dinar, buy what you want to drink. And we're saying in that case it's mutter. Of course it's mutter. He's completely disconnected. He's giving them money, saying do what you want with it. Miflog v'lesin b'didei, let us say a bigger chiddush, something more interesting, and make a chilik when it comes to when he himself is paying for it later, and say, Bameh dvar mamurim, when do we say that it's forbidden, or that whatever he buys is going to be Dmei Shvius, or Yenesech, or Tevel? B'chenvani hamakifo, that is, it's also when we're talking about a store owner who provides credit with whom there's a prior relationship. The mishtabed late, because the employer is already mishubad to the chenvani, to the store owner. Avo chenvani she'ein makifo. But if we're talking about a store owner who doesn't provide him with credit and with whom there is no prior relationship, mutter, well then it would be permitted because the payment would be considered completely disconnected from the shemitah or yenesech or tevel that was taken earlier and by this point is already consumed. He's paying for later. It would be permitted in a scenario where there's no prior relationship there. So therefore, right, if we're telling me that when there's no prior relationship it's permitted, give me that scenario in the Brisa and say that that is permitted. That's a more interesting scenario than when he says, take the money and do what you want with it. Of course that's going to be permitted. Another question. Chenvani she'ein makifo. In a scenario where the store owner does not have a prior relationship with the employer and does not provide credit for the employer, mi lo mishtabed, would the employer not immediately be mishubad? The Omar Ravid, but Ravid says, Omer lachaveroi tenmane liploni v'yiknu kol nichsoi loch konamidin orev. Sheesh. So what's this talking about? This is also a 3-point setup. This is talking about a scenario where, let's say, Shimon, who would be the equivalent of the employer or of Rabbi Yanai. So Shimon is saying to Reuven, now Reuven is the equivalent of the poor people, of the store owner, the chenvani. So Shimon is saying to Reuven, you give 100 zuzes to Levi. Levi is the equivalent of the employees of Rabbi Yanai's household. And then I, Shimon, will give you, Reuven, all of my stuff. That was confusing, but now that we laid it out, we'll make it not confusing. So again, what's the scenario? The scenario is, Shimon says to Reuven, you give 100 zuzes to Levi, and when you do that, I, Shimon, will give you all of my stuff. Now, let's put this into practical terms. By Rabbi Yanai, basically, Rabbi Yanai is saying to the poor people, you give Perish Shvius to my family, and when you do that, what we're asking is basically, it should be that Rabbi Yanai is basically saying, I'll immediately be chayiv to you to pay you back. But just like by Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, Shimon is saying to Reuven, give 100 zuzas to Levi, and when you do, Shimon, immediately will owe you all my stuff. Well, if we apply that to Rabbi Yanai, what would be happening is that Rabbi Yanai is saying to the poor people, give Perish Shvius to my family, and when you do that, I will immediately be chayiv to you to pay you back, which means it should be Dmei Shvius. It should not be considered disconnected. It should be immediate. Cheva, what do you think about that? Cheva, what do you think about that, Cheva? What do you think about that? Again, the Ode. And similarly, Chenvani she'ein makifo. a store owner who does not have a prior relationship there, does not provide credit for the employer, Milo mishtabed, would the employer not still immediately be chayiv to pay for whatever the employees took? Rav says, when Shimon says to Reuben, Teimane leploni, give 100 zuzas to Levi, v'yiknu kol nichsaylach, and when you do so, all of my stuff will belong to you. Kana midin arev. So Reuven is kona all of Shimon's stuff, just like Shimon has to pay Reuven all of his stuff, just like a guarantor who has nothing to gain from the loan or anything like that, and still is chayiv. So here also, even though it's Reuven giving stuff to Levi, Shimon is still chayiv to give Reuven all of his stuff. Okay, so we want to say by Rabbi Yanai as well, when the poor people give the pair shvius to his family, Rabbi Yanai should immediately be chayiv to pay the poor people, and it should be connected, not disconnected. Elo ma'rove, rather says Rove, lo yishno makif of lo shno ein makif. Okay, scratch the whole credit thing, the whole prior relationship thing. That's not what's important here. Avagav de mishabed lei kemdul miyachid shibude. Even in a scenario where there is a shibud, where there is a prior relationship, it doesn't matter. What's important is that the employer or Rabbi Yanai or Shimon is specifying what he is going to be giving. And if he doesn't specify exactly what he'll be giving, lo mitzer, then it is not osir. And therefore, in the case of Rabbi Yanai, the reason why it is not considered like he's chayib immediately is because he did not specify what exactly he would be paying back to aniyim. He only paid them back the next year with fruits of the 8th year. Therefore, that was permitted. It was not to make shvius. So then over here, in the case of the employer, why, when the employees take whatever they take, is it also for him to pay it back, to pay the store owner? Where am I? Why is the employer concerned about shvius? Halo miyachid shibude. He wasn't miyachid what he's going to be paying. Lo miyachid shibude. He wasn't miyachid what he's going to be paying. Rav Papa could go and shake him lo dinar. So Rav Papa says it's actually talking about where the employer did give the store owner a dinar in advance. So therefore, he was miyachid what the store owner was going to be paid from, and that is why it is osir. But otherwise, if not, so it would be considered disconnected. Rav Kahana says, Rav Kahana, I said over this whole sugya before Rav Zvid, Minardoya, Omar Li, and he says to me, if that's the case, that we're talking about where the employer had already given the dinar to the store owner, well then, well then, instead of the employer saying to his employees, go and eat, go and drink, and I will pay, he already paid. Should say, go eat and drink whatever you want, and then I'll make a cheshbin later on to figure out how much it comes out to, but not that I'll pay, I already paid. So says Rav Zvid, so says Rav Kahana, I told Rav Zvid Minardo, Tnitzu v'ani mechashev. So say that, no problem. Say, go and eat and drink, and I will make a cheshbin. Okay, fine, because they already paid, and that's why it's also. Rav Ashi Omer says, Rav Ashi kagon shenotal v'nosan biyad, that it's talking about where the employer actually took the stuff and gave it to the employees. Right, what does Rashi say? Shenosan miyara chenvani v'nosan loim. Imam took it from the chenvani and gave it to the employees. Omlev Yemar Lirav Ashi Yachiv. That's the case. Adoni tzu v'ichlu tzu v'shisu. Instead of saying go out and he'd go out and drink tlu v'ichlu tlu v'shisu mibayla. It should say take it and eat it. Take it and drink it. Amalei tni tlu v'ichlu tlu v'shisu. So Rav Ashi responds, okay, say take and eat, take and drink. No problem. Sheesh. Okay, gebaldet. And now I think we're basically done with that sugya. I think we got it all done in this one day. So so today's sugya was about paying for payers shvius, which we learned about yesterday, Demei shvius as kedusha shvius. We learned about it specifically in the context of when you pay for it at a later point through this scenario with Rabbi Yana and his family and the poor people, and that when he paid later on the next year, it was considered disconnected. He didn't specify in advance what he was going to be paying from, and he paid at a later date, at which point all the fruit was already consumed, so therefore it would be considered disconnected, and it was permitted. It was not kedushas shvius. Along the way, we had these nested similar scenarios, for example, by esnan zona. If you pay for harlot services, but you pay later, that korban would not be considered, that animal would not be considered esnan zona. It would be permitted to offer as a korban. And we also learned about this scenario where an employer pays for what the employees take, and we say that if he pays at a later point and didn't give the store owner in advance money, well, then it would be considered disconnected, just like by Rav Yanai and by the Esnan Zona. But if in advance he had given a dinar to the store owner, then it would be considered. Also, you'd have to be concerned about what the employees are taking, if they're taking shvius or tevel or yenesek. I hope that you enjoyed this daf. It was a pretty interesting daf, I think. Cheers.